Thank you, Sally. Right, good afternoon, everybody. So my talk is on national service, and looking around the room, I think there might be quite a number of you who can talk from personal experience on this subject, but not myself. I was too young. Anyway, the book that you see on the screen there is called Reluctant Warriors, Memories of National Service, 1945 to 1960. And during this period, some 2 million men were conscripted in Britain into the armed forces, usually for a period of 2 years. And yet the country was no longer at war. And that prompted two questions in my mind. First of all, why was this being done? And secondly, how do they feel about having 2 years taken out of their lives? Well, as to the why, well, in 1945, Britain had huge defence commitments. We still had an empire, although it was starting to crumble. But there was a growing clamour for independence in a number of our former colonies, and these were often backed up with terrorist movements. So a large number of troops were required to police these areas. Secondly, there was countries like Palestine, which wasn't part of the British Empire, but was being ruled under League of Nations mandate. And we had the unenviable task of trying to keep order in a country where thousands of Jewish Holocaust refugees were pouring into the country with the intention of setting up their historic homeland, being resisted by the Arab population who regarded it as their homeland. And it was the start of a conflict that continues to this day. Then there was Germany, which from May 1945 was placed under military government, jointly run by Britain, America, France, and the Soviet Union, Russia as we now call it. That also required a large commitment of troops. Now, the government was committed to releasing the men who'd served during the war, and there was no hope of replacing with enough volunteers to meet our requirements. The only answer was short-term conscription. And conscription was something that we didn't like in this country. We historically tried to avoid conscription, but there was no choice. They called it national service, which sounds a bit more noble than conscription, but that's what it was. It was conscription. And initially, there was no fixed period. Then in 1947, it was fixed at 18 months, and in 1950, it went up to 2 years, and it remained at 2 years until it was abolished. Second question, how do they feel about having 2 years taken out of their lives? Well, as I say, I can't speak from personal experience because I was 14 when it ended. But over the years, I've spoken to many men who did national service, and opinions ranged from I wouldn't have missed it for the world to an absolute waste of 2 years, and all shades of opinion in between. So I decided to try and find out a bit more about it, and I carried out over 60 interviews with men from Porthcawl, from Bridgend, from the Vale of Glamorgan, and having got enough material, I thought, for a book, I decided to put it all together. I had, as I say, 65 stories. Well, there were 54 stories that were worth going into the book. The others were not sufficiently different, really, to go in. Of those, 30 had served in the Army, 19 in the RAF, 3 in the Royal Navy, 1 in the Royal Marines, and 1 had been a conscientious objector. And of those 60-odd men I interviewed, only 1 said he'd actually hated it from start to finish. The others said they may have been reluctant to go in the first place, but looking back, they felt it had been a benefit to them. They'd learnt new skills, which very often carried forward into careers. Some went in intending only to do the statutory 2 years and ended up signing on for the rest of their lives. It was a chance to travel abroad at a time when mass tourism hadn't started. and it was a chance to go to experience foreign countries. And all right, it was on Her Majesty's service, but they often had time to go do some sightseeing and experience a different culture. Some actually met their wives on a national service, and all of them said that they came out with an increased feeling of self-confidence, of self-respect. They went in as boys and they came out as men. But I know there were many who did hate it. They're not the ones who contacted me. They were bored, they were homesick, they had family worries. It was an unwanted interruption to their careers that sometimes affected their relationships. And those who were unfortunate enough to be actually sent into a war zone, if they survived, they came back with perhaps PTSD and look back on some pretty dreadful experiences. So, as I say, having got enough material together for a book, I then had to decide how I was going to organize all these stories. And I decided to group them according to where the men were posted. Some were remained in the UK, some were posted to Germany, some went to the Middle East, and other overseas areas. I began with what they all had to go through at the start, basic training. And this was the sort of fairly brutal breaking them into service life. It could last from 6 to 16 weeks. It was designed to strip away your individuality, to stifle any ideas you might have had of rebellion, and you were molded. You were shaped into a cog in this vast military machine. The message was obey orders or you will be punished, and you learned a very healthy respect for authority. You spent your time going everywhere on the double, being shouted and screamed at by NCOs. You spent hours marching around the parade ground, square bashing as it was called, and when you weren't doing that, you were polishing your boots to mirror brilliance and polishing your buttons, and so on. So it was a pretty daunting period. But once you got through that, then the discipline became a little bit easier. Now, one man who wrote very eloquently about his basic training is Richard Todman, who was served in the Royal Armoured Corps from 1951 to 53, and I think what he wrote, you could say, is fairly typical of most people going through basic training. He said, like thousands of young men in their teens, I was instructed to attend a medical examination, and I was passed as A1. Asked which force I would like to serve in, I said, the Navy. You can't join the Navy, I was told, unless you're prepared to sign on for 5 years. Having no desire to serve more than the statutory 2 years, I opted for the Army, and was then asked which branch I preferred. Not keen on the infantry, I suggested a tank regiment. This appeared to be a good answer, and I was enlisted in the Royal Armoured Corps. Eventually my call-up papers arrived, and with a travel warrant and an instruction to report forthwith to Catterick Camp in Yorkshire. I had never heard of Catterick Camp, and Yorkshire was just a place on a school map, somewhere up north. I eventually arrived at Catterick Camp, together with numerous other fresh-faced, suited and booted young men, to be greeted by a smart-looking sergeant who said, "You horrible little men are in the army now, and we are going to make soldiers of you." We were kitted out by the quartermaster sergeant, who eyed us up and presented us with our battle dress uniforms, black boots, navy berets, and numerous items of webbing equipment. The sergeant we had met earlier informed us that we now held the rank of trooper in the Royal Armoured Corps. We were told our army number, which we had to memorize, issued with pay books, and given the obligatory short back and sides haircut. We had now lost our civilian identity. We were shown to the huts, which were to be our home for the next 8 weeks. We then started our basic training, the army's way of making us tough, fearless soldiers. Well, sort of. We undoubtedly learnt the hard way what discipline really was, and even the streetwise kids soon lost their city swagger. Do as you're told and you'll get on fine was the message that was drummed into us. Training consisted mainly of square bashing, which consisted of marching and drilling with 303 rifles from the First World War. During training, our lives would be dominated by a lance corporal whom we suspected of having been dropped on his head at an early age, which explained the warped sense of humour. An example of this was when he told us that we'd been naughty, horrible little men, and we were to parade in our off-duty time outside our hut with our eating irons, that's a knife, fork and spoon. As we just had tea, this seemed a strange request, and we wondered if we were going to a party. However, we soon learned when we were told to get down on our hands and knees and cut the grass outside the hut using our knives as shears. We hacked away until we satisfied our lance corporal who told us not to be naughty again. We never did find out what naughty thing we had done to deserve this bizarre punishment. Well, the next step, once you got through all that, was training for the job you were going to be doing. And now that you were regarded as being indoctrinated into the military mindset, discipline became more relaxed. And once you'd gone through that training, you could then be posted either to somewhere in the UK or overseas. And one country where many national servicemen were posted was Germany. Just give you a brief background about Germany. As I said earlier, at the end of the war, it was governed jointly by Britain, United States, France, and the Soviet Union. And each was given an area to govern. Now, Berlin, the capital, lay in the Russian zone, and so it was agreed that this would not belong to Russia. That would be jointly, it would be divided up like the country. It was divided into 4 zones of occupation so that all the government could take place in one place, and they were all together. And the idea was that the country would be governed in this way until all the Nazis had been rounded up and dealt with, and the country could be returned to civilian government. That was the theory. But unfortunately, Stalin had other ideas. He had no intention of returning his portion of Germany to elected civilian government. Instead, his plan was to impose a communist government on the country in the same way as he'd done in Poland and in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia and the other countries that had been liberated from the Germans. And he wanted the Western Allies out of Berlin. And so he tried to do this by setting up a blockade, blockading the roads and the railways and the canals, all means of transport to Berlin. The only way in then was by air. But the Western Allies decided that they were not going to be beaten, and they set up a constant 24-hour day delivery service by air into West Berlin. Everything, clothes, fuel, coal, food, everything that was needed to support this population of 2.2 million people was flown in. And we see there an American C-54 transport plane watched by an eager crowd of children who were delighted that they were still being supplied and that the communists were not going to take over. And after 11 months, Stalin lifted the blockade, but after that, there was now no hope of a reunified Germany. So Germany became 2 countries. So as the British and the French and the Americans, their part of Germany became the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, and the Soviet zone became the so-called German Democratic Republic, which we knew as East Germany. Berlin remained divided, not by the wall at this time, that came in 1961, but it was divided into East and West Berlin. So you've got this bizarre situation where Berlin, which lay 110 miles inside East Germany, but half of it belonged to West Germany. And the access roads, of course, had to be kept open, the rails and so on. And it remained in this situation for the next 40 years until the end of communism. But what it meant was that there had to be a very large British garrison both in Germany, in West Germany, and in West Berlin. And one man who witnessed the Berlin airlift was Keith Price, who served in the RAF from 1947 to 49. And Keith was based at RAF Gatow, where he witnessed the incredible armada of aircraft landing and taking off round the clock, and was impressed by the speed at which the Germans were unloading each aircraft as soon as it had landed. The planes did not always return empty, because despite the heavy bombing of Berlin, some manufacturing still remained, and the aircraft were shipping out the finished goods. So there's somebody who had a first-class witness of the Berlin airlift. And then some 10 years later, Richard Dobbs, who was in the Royal Engineers from 1958 to 60, was also posted to Berlin. He was a driver in the Royal Engineers. Now, I always thought the Royal Engineers just built bridges and built roads, but they did a lot more than that. And one of the jobs they did was running the postal service. Now, this seems a rather strange place as the headquarters of the British Forces Postal Service in Berlin. It is the Olympic Stadium, which was built, of course, for the 1936 Olympic Games, which Hitler used, of course, for propaganda purposes. But that was where he was based. He said, Richard found the Berliners friendly and hospitable. They welcomed the presence of British troops, as it provided a safeguard against any possible communist attempt to take over the city. And more civilians were employed by the military than soldiers. Anyone unable to get home for Christmas would be welcomed into German homes, and in fact, Richard and one of his pals was the recipient of local hospitality one year. He recalls hearing horror stories from his hosts of the Russian troops who occupied the city at the end of the war, primitive, illiterate men who had never seen a staircase and who washed in the toilets. Now, the next man was by no means a reluctant warrior. He was very unreluctant. He was so unreluctant that he signed on for 4 years instead of 2. His name was Anthony Jones. He was in the RAF regiment from 1953 to 57. The RAF regiment is like an army unit within the RAF, whose job is to defend airfields. He was posted to RAF Warn in Germany and visited Berlin on a rugby trip. He was a keen rugby player, and one of the advantages if you're good at sport in the forces was that you got lots of time off to train, and you were excused the more onerous duties like guard duties. So it's quite a cushy life if you're good at sport. The station commanding officer at RAF Warn was an ex-rugby player, and he organised travel all over Germany for the team to play other bases. One trip was to Berlin, and while they were there, they decided to see something of this bizarrely divided city. As they drove along Stalin Allee, the long main street through the East Zone, they noticed that what appeared to be solid buildings were in fact facades, behind which were still the remains of wartime bombing. Whereas in the West, much of the war damage had been cleared up. At this time, there was no wall, and it was easy to travel on the S-Bahn, the metro system, from one zone to another. However, on one occasion, they inadvertently got off in the Soviet zone and went into a bar. Immediately, all conversation stopped. A bit like going to a pub in North Wales, I reckon. All conversation stopped, for although they were in civvies, their dress was recognisably Western. They hastily left and caught the next train back to the British zone. Now, we've heard a lot about the bombing of Dresden, which is regarded as an atrocity because it was a medieval city, very little military value, and it was heavily bombed in February 1945. Well, this is another city, Hildesheim, which was similarly badly bombed about a month later, But it was here, at Hildesheim, that Harry Loman was posted. Now, Harry Loman, of course, is a well-known U3A member. Well, Harry was in the Royal Army Education Corps from 1957 to 59, and he was another unreluctant warrior because he was determined to make the most of his time in Germany. He said, "A God-given opportunity, and I was determined to make the most of my time in Germany." And he socialized with local people. He learned to speak German and actually passed his GCE O-level in German. He visited opera houses, because of course we know Harry's a music lover, and he went skiing. He wrote, "There was no shortage of places to socialize in the town, including cafes offering temptations the like of which we had never seen before. And in his off-duty hours, he would go with a group of colleagues for Kaffee und Kuchen, Schnitzel with remoulade sauce, or a Bauernfrühstück, which is a farmer's breakfast. To establish social contact with the local people, he and Greg, a colleague, approached the authorities to set up an Anglo-German club, and having been given permission, obtained and decorated the hall in the education centre. A bit of publicity around town and willing volunteers made certain that our first meeting was a tremendous success, with a goodly number of young German and British soldiers and a total lack of enmity. Most memorable was the Christmas party, where hundreds of candles shed such a magical light on the proceedings. For the first time in my life, it really felt like Christmas." Well, of course, apart from this socializing, Harry did have a job to do. He was in the Royal Army Education Corps, and their job was to provide education to the men of the lower ranks who maybe needed to make up some deficiencies in their education, ready for promotion or preparation for discharge. So he said, I led a full and eventful social life with parties, barbecues, dancing and drinking, not always in moderation, with both British and German friends, some of whom remain in contact to this day. My military duties were so few and far between that I could almost forget I was a soldier. Little more than a teacher in a khaki uniform. I never went on parade, I never fired a gun, never went on exercise, never saw action. I led a very cushy existence. And in conclusion, he said, "National service had been, for me, a truly wonderful experience, and without doubt, the best 2 years of my life." And in fact, it led on to a career because when he came out of the army, he went into a teacher training college and became a teacher for the rest of his life. Now, not all men went in at 18. You could defer your national service if you were doing an apprenticeship or going to university. And one man who didn't go until he was 24 was Russell Jones. He did a student apprenticeship in electrical engineering. When he went in, he'd actually got married the year before, to my sister Joy, in fact. But he could not bring her over. National servicemen were not able to take their wives abroad with them. So they faced a fairly long period of separation. However, a solution was found. When Russell was asked if he would like to bring his wife over to do house guarding with him. Many of the properties in the town, this was Hamelin, by the way, famous for the Pied Piper. He was able to, if he was prepared to bring his wife with him, I'm going ahead. Many of the properties in the town had been requisitioned for army personnel, and there was often a gap of several weeks between one family leaving and another one moving in. While they stood empty, they would be liable to be vandalized. So a couple of squaddies would occupy them as house guardians while they stood empty. So if Joy was prepared to put up with frequent house moves, she could come over and they could be together. Naturally, she took little persuading, and within a few weeks, the couple were happily reunited. And they enjoyed the rest of the time in Germany. But of course, they could never forget the fact that they were only a few miles away from a very hostile enemy, and they had to be prepared to pack up and go at short notice should the need arise. So all families had to have a flap box containing essential items. If the order came to leave, only these boxes could be taken. Everything else would have to be left. Fortunately, none of these measures had to be carried out. Well, from Germany, we move on to the Middle East, and specifically Cyprus and Egypt. Now, Cyprus was a very different place at that time from what it is today. Today it's a popular tourist attraction with lovely beaches and mountains and so on. But in the 1950s, when it was a British Crown colony, it was a place of danger and hostility. Its population was a mixture of Cypriots and Greeks, Greeks and Turks. And the Greeks wanted reunion with Greece, the Turks with Turkey, and the two sides were fighting it out. The British were trying to keep control because for Britain it was a vital military and naval base. They also had to be fighting against the Aoka terrorists supporting the Greeks. Egypt was, again, not a British colony as such, but it had been under informal British control since the 1880s. And after the war, under the rule of King Farouk, he was happy to have the British there, but many of the population were not, and there were frequent attacks on British soldiers. In 1952, Farouk was overthrown by Colonel Abdel Nasser, who in 1956 nationalised the Suez Canal, and this prompted the British government under Anthony Eden to launch an invasion together with France and Israel to gain it back. Well, unfortunately, they did not have the support of the Americans, who regarded this as a colonialist venture, and so the British government was faced with the humiliating situation of having to pull out almost as soon as they got there. And many national servicemen were amongst those who were sent out to this area. So going back to Cyprus then, and in the next picture, we see a group of fierce-looking young Royal Marines, and the one on the far left is one you may not recognize now, but he is very well known to us. He's the founder of Porthcawl U3A. It is Doug Jones. Oh, I'm supposed to be, oh, sorry. Oh, sorry, I'm pressing the wrong thing. There we are, there he is. So Doug was served in the Royal Marines from 1956 to 58, and he was posted to Cyprus, where they were, as I said earlier, they were trying to keep the peace between the Greeks and the Turks. Doug's unit was in the Pathos forest up in the mountains, where it was relatively safe, though they could be ambushed at any time. He soon realized that the local people were always one step ahead of the British. Shepherds would call to one another when a daytime patrol was spotted, and even at night they seemed to know exactly where the soldiers were. And Doug recalls arriving in a village one pitch-black night, and the only light came from the tavern, and when the patrol went in, having made what they thought was a stealthy approach, 6 cups of coffee were on the table ready for them. One task which Doug intensely disliked was having to search people's homes, and he was always impressed by the tolerance and courtesy of the inhabitants. They knew the British were there to protect them, yet at the same time they were foreign intruders, and sometimes he had to arrest suspects, and he recalls the distressing sight of women and children screaming because their men were being taken away. Now, I said the Royal Engineers did some rather unusual things. One was skippering landing craft, and this was the job of Rex Chess, who was in the Royal Engineers from 1957 to 59, another U3A member, and in fact was a friend, a boyhood friend of Doug. Like Doug, he grew up in Kenfig Hill, and Rex spent most of his national service in Cyprus, although the two men, he and Doug, never met because they were in different parts. Doug was in the Troodos Mountains, and Rex was in Famagusta. And Rex did not actually come into contact with terrorists. As skipper of a landing craft, his job involved taking supplies to British and American ships moored in the harbour and helping with the civilian trade. He, as I say, he did not have much contact with terrorists. He said, most of the fighting he witnessed was between different regiments of the British Army. To avoid the conflict, the men of the Royal Ulster Rifles and the men of the Welsh Regiment had to have their time off at different weekends. Now, this is another, sadly an ex-UCA member now because he passed away last year. This is Conrad Horse. Now, Conrad was a working-class lad from Maesteg, but he became an officer, and officers were usually drawn from a little bit higher up the social scale. But Conrad had served as an officer in the Merchant Navy before he joined the army. At 16, he joined the Merchant Navy as an apprentice. At 18, he became third officer, which meant that he was in charge of the ship for 8 hours a day. Quite a daunting task for a youngster. But he left at the age of 20 because he could see how the effects of long separation were affecting the married men. He wasn't married himself at the time, but he didn't want to be in that situation. So he decided to leave the Merchant Navy. But that meant that he was no longer exempt from national service because you had to serve 7 years in the Merchant Navy, and he'd only served 4. So he joined the army. And his experience, of course, as an officer soon marked him out as potential for officer training. And he was selected to go to Eton Hall in Cheshire. Now, normally it took 2 years to train an officer, but because that was the entire period of the national service, so for national servicemen, the period was cut down to 4 months. And so it was pretty intensive. And he came out 4 months later as a second lieutenant, as you see him there. He joined the parachute regiment, where he had almost a life-threatening experience because he jumped out of the plane, but he said, the strings of my parachute became entangled and the chute did not open. I was hurtling towards the ground. I was about to open my reserve chute when the main one finally opened, only just in time for me to land safely. Although I had jumped last in the group of 8 men, I was first on the ground, much to their surprise. So his regiment was stationed in Cyprus, just outside Nicosia, and Conrad was put in charge of a platoon, and their duties were mainly policing the villages and towns and patrolling the mountains and forested areas of northern Cyprus in search of terrorists, so much as what Doug had been doing. On one occasion, a bomb was thrown from the window of a house onto a jeep passing below. A major in the jeep was very badly injured. Conrad was ordered to go up there and sort them out so they won't do it again. He took 40 armed paratroopers and, on the pretense of searching for arms, went into every house and ransacked it, coldly in front of weeping women and dumbfounded children. We found no arms. And he said, the scene has haunted me ever since. In 1956, Conrad was part of the abortive Suez operation, landed in Egypt, but was ordered to leave, before any firing had taken place. Now, here we have another U3A member on the front left. Oh, done it again. There. Again, we won't recognise him from that, but that is Slow Williams, one of our more aged members, 92 years old, I think now. Now, Slow was one of the first national servicemen. He was called up in October 1945, so just a couple of months after the war ended. And at that time, there was no fixed term of national service. He didn't know how long he was going to be in for. He did his basic training in Northern Ireland, and he wrote, it was decided that Williams 431 was a bright lad, but lacked the qualities required of an infantryman, being unable, in his own words, to hit a barn door from 10 yards with a rifle, and nor to throw a grenade far enough away to avoid being showered by mud as it exploded. So he was sent to train as a medical orderly in the Royal Army Medical Corps. He was posted to one or two military hospitals in the UK, and then he was sent out to Egypt. Landing at Port Said was quite an experience for a country lad from North Wales. Hearing a new language, seeing people dressed in strange clothes, the women covered from head to foot with only their eyes visible. They were besieged by beggars who were sent away, politely or otherwise, by the old soldiers who had served there previously. So ended up in doing 3 years. He was actually offered to be promoted to sergeant if he signed on for a further year, but he decided that 3 years was enough, and so he was demobbed, and he then went into the police force and had a good career there. Now, other war zones where national servicemen were sent were countries like Malaya, Kenya, and Korea. Now, I didn't actually meet anybody who'd served in either Malaya or Kenya, but there was one man who served in Korea, and that was David Dunn. Now, David has actually passed away now, but it was his widow who told me, based on what he told her, about his time in Korea. Korea, of course, was a conflict that's never been resolved. Technically, North and South Korea are still at war, although Donald Trump apparently reckons he's going to sort the situation out. But it's been going on for over 70 years. David's job, David was in the REME, the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, and his job was retrieving and repairing tanks which had been damaged in the conflict, which often placed him under enemy fire. He was lucky to escape injury when doing this, and also when it was discovered that a dirt road along which he'd frequently travelled had an unexploded mine in the middle. The weather conditions in Korea were appalling, unbearably hot in summer, freezing cold in the winter. They lived 20 to a hut with a stove in the middle on which a bowl of ice was placed in the mornings to provide water for the men to wash in. They sometimes had to sleep outdoors in temperatures well below zero, keeping their rifles in their sleeping bags to prevent them from freezing up. So a pretty unpleasant place to be posted to. Now, moving on to those who were posted in the UK, because not all national servicemen were posted abroad, depending on what the needs were. Now, the first of the men who was posted, remained in the UK, is somebody who, again, you may not recognize from this picture, but this handsome young man with a magnificent head of hair is Second Lieutenant John Pearman of the King's Own Royal Rifles. So John was selected for officer training, and like Conrad Horse, he went to Eton Hall and found it extremely intensive. On completion, he was commissioned in the King's Own Royal Regiment, based in Lancaster. Exercises were held on the North York Moors, another hostile and challenging environment. And here we see him with one of his colleagues on exercise. And here they trained as infantry in the Lightning Brigade, ready to go anywhere at short notice, and were at one stage about to be deployed to Kuwait, but was stood down at the last minute. Now, I said earlier that a number of men met their wives through national service. Well, John was one of them. He was on a train with a group of his fellow officers, and on the same train were a group of young ladies who were going home from college for the Christmas holidays. And he said, finding ourselves in the same train from Chester, we young officers, confident in trench coats and peaked caps, called on the Army's tactical weapon of surprise by inviting the students to join us for a cup of tea. As a result, I have now been married to my wonderful wife Jill for 57 years, the outcome of a successful military mission. Now, this looks, to all intents and purposes, just an ordinary bungalow in the middle of a forest. It's not what it seemed. It was, in fact, the entrance to a secret underground bunker at a place called Kelvin and Hatch. And this is where Jeff Davis, another U3A member, served in the Royal Artillery between 1952 and 54. So he was a part of an anti-aircraft unit operating in conjunction with the RAF plotters controlling aircraft movements, and he was located on the lowest floor of Kelvedon Hatch. In the early 1950s, once Russia had become a potentially hostile nuclear power, the government decided to build secret underground bunkers from which it could continue to operate in the event of a nuclear war. One of these was at Kelvedon Hatch. Built in 1952 and 53, it was 125 feet deep, on 3 floors, and protected by 400 tons of concrete. It could accommodate around 500 personnel, with dormitories, catering facilities, and a sick bay. It had central heating, air conditioning, and a water supply, and was packed with the latest electronic communications equipment. Entries was through an innocuous-looking bungalow surrounded by woods. It was maintained by the Ministry of Defence until 1992, when it was decommissioned following the end of the Cold War. It is now open to the public as a tourist attraction. Now, you may have noticed that all the men I've mentioned served either in the Army or the RAF. What about the Navy? Well, if you remember when Richard Todman said he wanted to join the Navy, he was told you can't join the Navy unless you're prepared to sign on for 5 years. Obviously, most men didn't want to do that, so they didn't go in the Navy. However, the Navy did take on some men on 2-year enlistments, and 3 of the men I interviewed served in the Navy for 2 years. And one of them was this man. His name's John Lewis, and it's not the John Lewis, by the way. He was accepted into the Navy, and one of the reasons may have been the fact that he did an apprenticeship as a 5-year apprenticeship at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Aberporth, and worked on guided missiles. So he was taken on by the Navy, and after a tough 6 weeks of basic training at Victoria Barracks in Portsmouth, he was posted to the gunnery school at Whale Island, where he qualified as a petty officer in charge of armaments. John was then posted to HMS Wrangler, an anti-submarine frigate. He soon got used to sleeping in a hammock and was never troubled by seasickness, despite experiencing some very rough waters. The rest of his national service can best be described as a Mediterranean cruise. The ship paid courtesy visits to Greece, Spain, Gibraltar, Sicily, and various North African ports. They did do some serious work sometimes, firing 4-inch shells at targets, although John confesses that they missed far more than they hit. At that time, of course, the Navy still maintained the tradition of the rum issue every day. And at 11 a.m., the up pipes would be called, and the crew would line up for their ration of rum. Now, the lower the ratings had theirs watered down, 2 on 1, 2 parts water to 1 part rum. But the petty officers and the officers, they took theirs neat. So whether they were thought to have stronger heads than the lower ranks, I don't know. Of course, as a 21-year-old petty officer, John did experience a certain amount of resentment from the older hands, the ones who'd taken many years to get to this point. And here comes this young whippersnapper, and he's allowed to share the mess and enjoy the neat rum ration and so on. But he wasn't put off by that. Now, one other person, I don't have a picture of him actually, who did an unusual form of national service, was Dennis Tomlin. Now, he was a conscientious objector. He decided he was prepared to do national service, but not in a military capacity. And he, through the support of the Quaker movement, he had to go to a tribunal, and he was allowed, he was excused military service, but he had to do some sort of community work. Excuse me. And he went over to France, and he worked on one was building a centre for a residential centre for children from Paris who'd been displaced. Other work was agricultural work and so on. And he's another one who actually met his wife whilst he was in France. And they married, and they are still together today. But he, as I say, he did 2.5 years altogether. So, you know, he had to give some sort of service, but it didn't, as long as it didn't involve killing people. Well, in conclusion then, I've talked about why national service began. Why did it end in 1960? Well, a number of reasons. Britain no longer had the vast defence commitments that it had in 1945. The empire had morphed into the Commonwealth. A number of countries had gained independence. Others were due to be made independent. And so that the need for vast forces to police these countries was no longer there. Also, after Suez, I think it caused a bit of a rethink amongst our defence chiefs. You know, we were, or amongst our politicians anyway, that we were no longer the world's policemen. That role had been taken over by the Americans. And so it's time to have a rethink as to how much we were spending on defence. It was also very expensive to maintain national service. If you think there were thousands of young men out of the labour market, having to be housed and fed and paid and transported, it was a huge drain on the economy. And there was a moral aspect to it as well. Was it right to conscript young men to go away and face being killed, not in the defence of their country? So there was mounting public pressure to end national service during the 1950s. And above all, the defence chiefs wanted professionals. They didn't want conscripts. They wanted men who joined the forces as a career, and not men who were unwilling conscripts who didn't want to be there in the first place. So for all these reasons, national service came to an end in 1960. The last national serviceman finished his service in 1963. But of course, since then, there have been many calls to bring back national service. Bring back national service and sort these young hooligans out. Well, that is really misunderstanding the purpose of national service. It was not meant as a sort of a reform school for wayward youths. It was a military necessity. And once the military necessity wasn't there, there was no point to continuing it. And of course, it overlooks the fact that you could get killed. More than 300 national servicemen were killed on active service. And of course, the other thing is these days, you couldn't just be conscripting men, it would have to be women as well. And I don't know how well that would go down. So, for all these reasons, national service, bringing back national service was never an option. Now, I don't know whether you have any questions you want to ask or any reminiscences that you'd like to share of your own national service if you did it. Any? No? No. Yes, Gwyn.
One of the things I particularly remember is landing up in Germany in 1946. And first of all, the devastation of places like Hanover from bombing was astonishing. But we ended up in a little German town called Gelsberg, where we'd evicted the residents, and we were living in their bungalows and houses. And I remember going into this bathroom and seeing this strange device which I'd never ever seen before, which of course was a bidet. The barracks were triple glazed. And of course Hitler had started supplying the people's car, where when it was your turn to pick up your Volkswagen, you went to the factory in Wolfsburg, and there was a long corridor, the balcony along the top, and you watched your car being built, and at the end you got into it and drove it away. Germany was a very interesting country, I must say.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It was really interesting, but there was no mention of Bevan boys. Do I need to say that again?
Yeah.
I said you didn't mention Bevan boys.
I thought that was just during the war. Did that continue after the war?
Well, my chief bridesmaid's husband was a Bevan boy, and he wouldn't have been old enough
Right.
at the end of the war
Yeah.
to have been called up.
Right. I did actually. One U3A member was, I suppose, what you might call a voluntary Bevan boy, because he didn't want to go into the forces because I think he didn't want to be too far away from his mother who was ill. So he did his national service down the mines, but that was, as I say, that was voluntary on his part. I thought the scheme ended when the war ended, so that's why. No other? Well, thank you very much for listening.